The sun was high over Willow Creek, but for Sarah Jenkins, the world had never felt darker. She stood in the center of the dusty square, her head bowed as the whispers swirled like a gathering storm. In the Old West, a woman's reputation was more than just her name, it was her survival. One false word from a powerful man had stripped her of everything. No one would look her in the eye. No one would offer a hand. She was being erased while she still drew breath. That was until the sound of heavy boots broke the rhythm of the jeers. A man who didn't belong to the town, a man with the mountains in his eyes, stepped forward and changed her fate with 4 simple words.
Welcome back to Rescued by the Ridge. Today, we bring you a journey of redemption and the unbreakable strength of the human spirit. If you find peace in these stories of the high country, please hit that like button and subscribe. Your support helps us keep these forgotten tales alive.
Willow Creek was a town built on hard work and even harder judgments. In the summer of 1884, the heat didn't just dry up the creek, it seemed to sour the very hearts of the people living there. Sarah Jenkins felt that bitterness more than anyone. She was a seamstress by trade, a woman who spent her days mending the torn lives of others with a needle and thread. She was quiet, diligent, and alone. In a frontier town, being a single woman without family was a delicate dance. You had to be beyond reproach. Your character was your currency. If you lost your standing, you lost your ability to eat, to work, and to exist. The trouble started at the Higgins estate. Mayor Higgins was a man who measured his worth by the gold in his pockets and the fear in his neighbors' eyes. When a heavy 14-karat gold pocket watch went missing from his study, he didn't look for the truth, he looked for a scapegoat. He pointed his polished finger at the woman who had been mending his curtains, Sarah. He didn't need proof, his word was the law of the land. By the next morning, the shunning had begun. As Sarah walked to the market to buy a simple loaf of bread, the world turned cold. Mrs. Gable, a woman Sarah had helped nurse through a fever just a month prior, pulled her daughter away as if Sarah carried the plague. The shopkeeper, Mr. Henderson, didn't even look up from his ledger. He simply placed a sign on the counter that read, "No credit for thieves." Sarah stood in the middle of the dusty street. The silence of the town was louder than any shout. This was the cruelty of the Old West social order. They wouldn't put her in a cell. They would simply wait for the hunger and the shame to drive her out into the wilderness. Her hands trembled as she clutched her shawl. She felt invisible, a ghost haunting her own life. She looked toward the horizon where the jagged peaks of the ridge loomed like giants. She had nowhere to go and no one to turn to. Just as the mayor stepped out onto his porch to enjoy the spectacle of her misery, a low, rhythmic thud echoed through the square. It was the sound of a heavy horse, a draft cross built for the high trails. A man sat tall in the saddle, his face shadowed by a wide-brimmed hat. He wasn't from Willow Creek. He carried the scent of pine needles and cold wind. The rider pulled the reins, stopping his horse directly between Sarah and the prying eyes of the town. The horse was a massive buckskin, its coat caked with the fine gray dust of the long trails. But it wasn't the animal that held the town's breath. It was the man in the saddle. Gideon North didn't look like the bankers or the merchants of Willow Creek. He wore a coat of oiled canvas and leggings of worn elk skin. He was a man shaped by the elements, as rugged and unyielding as the granite peaks he called home. He didn't look at the mayor. He didn't look at the crowd gathering on the boardwalks. His eyes, a piercing shade of slate gray, were fixed entirely on Sarah. He saw the way she held her breath.
He saw the way her knuckles were white from gripping her threadbare shawl. In the high country, men like Gideon learned to read the land. They knew that a sudden silence in the brush meant a predator was near. Here, in the heart of town, the silence was just as predatory. Mayor Higgins cleared his throat, leaning over his porch railing. "Move along, woodsman," the mayor barked, his voice thin and sharp. "This woman is under a cloud of thievery. She's no concern of yours." Gideon didn't reach for a weapon. He didn't even raise his voice. He simply dismounted with a slow, deliberate grace that commanded the space around him. To the people of the frontier, a man's presence was often his strongest tool. He took 2 steps towards Sarah, his heavy spurs clinking softly, a sound that, in the stillness of the square, sounded like a tolling bell. He stopped just a few feet from her. He could see the tracks of dried tears on her cheeks. "The ridge is a long ride," Gideon said, his voice deep and raspy, like stones rolling in a riverbed. "And I find myself in need of someone who knows how to mend gear and keep a steady hearth. The pay is honest, the air is clean." Sarah looked up, her breath hitching. She saw no judgment in his face, only a quiet, steady strength. In that moment, the educational reality of the West was laid bare. For a woman in her position, survival didn't come from a courtroom. It came from the protection of someone who lived outside the reach of townside gossip. I have nothing to give you, sir," Sarah whispered, her voice cracking. Gideon reached out, not to grab her, but to offer a steady hand. "You have your dignity," he replied, loud enough for the mayor to hear, "and that's worth more than gold in the high country." He leaned closer, his shadow falling over her like a shield. "You're safe now," he murmured. Sarah looked back at the town that had turned its back on her, then at the hand offered by the mountain man. She reached out and took it. The crowd stayed silent as Gideon helped her onto the back of his pack horse, securing her small bundle of sewing supplies with a professional's knot. As they turned their backs on Willow Creek, the trail ahead began to rise toward the clouds. Sarah didn't look back, but she could feel the weight of the town lifting, replaced by the daunting, beautiful shadow of the mountains.
The rhythmic clopping of hooves on the hard-packed earth was the only sound as Willow Creek faded into a miniature of itself. Sarah didn't look back. She couldn't. To look back was to acknowledge the sting of the faces she had known for years, faces that had turned to stone the moment a lie was whispered. As they crossed the valley floor, the air began to change. The stifling, dusty heat of the town was replaced by a creeping coolness that rolled off the distant snowcaps. Gideon rode ahead, his back a broad wall of canvas and leather. He didn't make small talk. In the wilderness, unnecessary noise was a waste of energy, and Gideon North was a man who lived by the laws of efficiency. By the time the sun began to dip toward the jagged horizon, the trail grew steep and narrow. This was the entrance to the ridge, a place where the rules of men were replaced by the laws of nature. Gideon pulled his horse to a halt near a narrow switchback. He hopped down and walked back to Sarah's horse. "We stop here," he said. "The horses need to blow before the final climb." He reached up to check the cinches on Sarah's saddle. This was an essential lesson for any traveler in the high country. "In the valley, you ride for comfort," he explained, his voice grounding her. "Up here, you ride for balance. If your cinch is too loose, the saddle slides on the grade. If it's too tight, the horse can't draw the deep breaths it needs to climb." He showed her how to slide 2 fingers between the leather strap and the horse's barrel, the mark of a rider who respected his animal. Sarah watched his hands. They were calloused and scarred, but they moved with a gentleness she hadn't expected. For the first time in days, the tightness in her chest began to loosen. "Why did you do it?"
she asked softly, the mountain wind catching her words. "Why risk your name for a stranger the whole town called a thief?" Gideon looked out over the vast expanse below. From this height, Willow Creek looked like nothing more than a handful of pebbles in a dry wash. "I've lived long enough to know that the loudest voices in a room are rarely the ones speaking the truth. And out here, a person is judged by what they do today, not what a mayor says about their yesterday." He handed her a canteen. The water was icy and tasted of minerals and earth. As she drank, she realized the world was much larger than the four walls of her sewing room. But as the shadows of the towering pines stretched out like long, dark fingers, she also realized how vulnerable she really was.
The twilight deepened into a bruised purple as they reached a small plateau sheltered by a stand of ancient hemlocks. The wind began to moan through the needles, a lonely sound that made the vastness of the ridge feel even more imposing. Gideon moved with practiced precision. He didn't just toss logs into a pile, he carefully cleared a circle down to the mineral soil, removing dry needles and twigs that could lead to a runaway fire. "In the mountains, the fire is your life," Gideon remarked, looking at Sarah, "but you must respect it. Clear the ground, or the ground will burn you." This was the first rule of the high country. Survival required a constant awareness of one's surroundings. As the first flames licked at the dry cedar kindling, the golden light pushed back the suffocating darkness. Sarah sat on a flat rock, her hands outstretched. She noticed she was still flinching at the crackle of the wood. The trauma of the town square, the jeers, the cold stares, was a shadow that followed her even here. Gideon noticed. He didn't offer empty platitudes. Instead, he went to his pack and pulled out a heavy wool blanket, handing it to her. "The cold up here doesn't just bite the skin," he said softly. "It tries to get inside the spirit. Wrap up." He set about making a simple meal of dried beef and hardtack soaked in a tin of boiling water to make it palatable. As they ate, the silence was no longer heavy, it was peaceful. Sarah looked at him across the dancing flames. "You said you were an outcast once too," she ventured, her voice barely a whisper. Gideon stared into the embers, the firelight carving deep lines into his face. "Years ago," he began, "I believed that if I followed every rule, the world would be fair. I was a lawman in a town not unlike yours. I refused to look the other way when a local cattle baron broke the law. By the next week, I was the one they called a criminal. They took my badge, but they couldn't take my peace. So I found a place where the only law is the turning of the seasons." Sarah felt a surge of kinship. In the Old West, the law was often just a tool for the powerful. But here, under a sky filled with 1,000 diamonds, the mayor's lies felt small. Gideon stood up and pointed to a spot near the fire. "I'll be sleeping by the horses. They're restless tonight. You take the soft ground by the hemlock. You're under my protection, Sarah. Sleep deep." For the first time in years, Sarah Jenkins didn't lie awake wondering what the neighbors would say. She listened to the steady breathing of the horses and the low hum of the wind, falling into a sleep that felt, for the first time, like freedom.
Morning on the ridge arrived not with a soft glow, but with a sharp, biting clarity. The air was so thin and pure, it felt like drinking from a cold spring. Sarah woke to the smell of pine smoke and the steady rhythm of a whetstone against steel. Gideon was already awake, sharpening his camp knife, his eyes scanning the horizon where heavy, slate-colored clouds were stacking against the peaks. "The mountain is changing her mind," Gideon said, nodding toward the darkening sky. "We need to move. High passes are no place to be when the clouds sit down." They broke camp with a speed that tested Sarah's stamina. As they climbed higher, the trail narrowed until it was little more than a ribbon of shale clinging to the side of a granite wall. Suddenly, the path forward disappeared. A massive rock fall, likely triggered by a spring thaw or a recent tremor, had choked the gorge. Below them lay a sheer drop,
Above, an impassable wall of loose stone. In the valley, such a roadblock would be a nuisance. Out here, it was a life-or-death equation. Gideon dismounted and walked to the edge. "We can't go back," he muttered, more to himself than to her. "The mayor's men might be scouting the lower trails. We go through the Devil's Wash, the old creek bed." This was a lesson in mountain navigation. The shortest path is rarely the safest. Gideon led Sarah's horse down a steep embankment into a dry, rocky channel. He taught her how to read the stones, looking for the moss-covered rocks that offered grip versus the smooth, round ones that would roll under a horse's weight and snap a leg. "Watch the ears of your mount," Gideon instructed, his hand steady on her bridle. "A horse feels the ground before you see it. If she hesitates, you trust her." As they navigated the treacherous bed, a low rumble echoed through the canyon. It wasn't thunder. It was the sound of a flash flood from a distant rain higher up the peak. The dry wash was about to become a river. Sarah felt the panic rising, a cold knot in her stomach. But she looked at Gideon's back, straight, calm, and unshakable. She realized that survival wasn't just about strength. It was about the refusal to let fear take the reins. They pushed the horses into a hard scramble, climbing a steep goat path just as a wall of muddy water and debris roared into the channel they had occupied moments before. Standing on the high bank, drenched in a sudden, icy rain, Sarah looked down at the rushing water. She wasn't the trembling seamstress from Willow Creek anymore. She was a woman who had just looked the mountain in the eye and didn't blink.
The roar of the flash flood slowly faded into a dull hum as they climbed further away from the wash. The air grew thinner, and the silence of the high timber settled over them once more. But it was a fragile silence. Sarah's heart was still hammering against her ribs, a drumbeat of adrenaline and lingering fear. She looked at her hands. They were stained with mountain soil and scratched by shale, but they were steady. Gideon pulled his buckskin to a halt under a ledge of overhanging limestone. He wasn't looking at the trail ahead. He was looking back, his eyes narrowed against the glare of the wet rocks. He reached into his saddlebag and pulled out a brass field glass, bringing it to his eye. "What is it?" Sarah whispered, her voice catching. Gideon didn't answer for a long moment. He handed the glass to her and pointed toward a distant ridge, miles below. Through the lens, Sarah saw 3 tiny, dark specks moving with purposeful speed. They weren't travelers, and they weren't mountain men. They rode in a tight formation, the hallmark of men used to the flatlands and the authority of a badge. "The sheriff," Sarah breathed, her face going pale. "The mayor won't let it go. He wants his scapegoat back." In the Old West, a powerful man's pride was often more dangerous than a winter storm. To Mayor Higgins, Sarah's escape wasn't just a loss of a servant, it was a challenge to his absolute control over Willow Creek. "They're tracking us," Gideon said, his voice as cold as the rain. "But they're tracking like men who think the world is flat. They're following the obvious trail." This provided a vital lesson in frontier survival. Camouflage isn't just about hiding your body, it's about hiding your intent. Gideon led Sarah off the main path and onto a stretch of rimrock, exposed hard stone that left no hoofprints and held no scent. "We stay on the granite," Gideon instructed, "and we cross the timberline. They won't have the lungs for the high air, and their horses aren't shod for the slide rock." As they moved, Sarah felt a new kind of tension. It wasn't the raw, elemental fear of the flood, but the calculated dread of being hunted. She realized that Gideon wasn't just a guide, he was a strategist. He was teaching her that when you were the prey, you must know the mountain better than the predator. "Why go to all this trouble for me?" she asked as they reached a high, hidden cove. Gideon paused, looking at the distant riders. "Because out here, Sarah, an injustice in the valley is a poison that can reach even the peaks.
If I let them take you, I'm no better than the men who stood by and watched them shame you."
The final ascent was a test of lung and limb. As they crested the last jagged spine of the ridge, the world seemed to open up into a hidden kingdom. Nestled in a high alpine meadow, surrounded by a natural fortress of towering spruce and granite walls, sat Gideon's home. It wasn't a grand estate like the one Sarah had fled, but a sturdy cabin of hand-hewn logs, notched with a precision that spoke of years of solitary labor. "We're home," Gideon said simply. The word home hit Sarah with the force of a physical blow. She hadn't realized how much she had missed the feeling of a place where she didn't have to keep her guard up. The transition from survival to living began immediately. Life on the ridge was a masterclass in self-sufficiency. In the Old West, making do was the difference between thriving and perishing. Gideon showed Sarah the smokehouse, explaining the chemistry of using green hickory and salt to cure meat so it would last through the long mountain winters. He showed her the root cellar, dug deep into the earth to maintain a constant temperature, protecting their stores from the killing frost. "Everything has a purpose here," Gideon remarked as he showed her how to use a draw knife to shave shingles for a roof repair. "In town, people buy what they need and forget where it comes from. Out here, if you want it, you build it. If you break it, you fix it." Sarah found her own rhythm. Her skilled fingers, once used to fine silk and lace for the mayor's wife, now handled coarse wool and heavy canvas. She repaired Gideon's weathered gear, reinforcing seams to withstand the mountain gales. She learned to identify the edible flora of the high country, wild onions, mountain berries, and the medicinal properties of willow bark for aches. Educational value was woven into every hour. She learned that a clean hearth wasn't just about tidiness, it was about fire safety in a wooden structure miles from help. She learned that every scrap of fabric or fat could be repurposed, nothing was wasted. As the weeks passed, the hollow look in Sarah's eyes began to fade. The mountain air was a tonic, and the hard work was a bridge back to herself. She realized that the shame the town had heaped on her was a weight she no longer had to carry. In the silence of the ridge, she wasn't a thief or an outcast. She was a woman who could survive the wild, a woman who had earned her place under the sun. But even in paradise, the echoes of the valley remained. One evening, while mending one of Gideon's old winter coats, her needle hit something hard sewn into the lining. The fire in the hearth crackled, throwing long amber shadows across the cabin walls as Sarah worked. Her needle, a silver flash in the dim light, suddenly met resistance. It wasn't the thick canvas of the coat's hem, but something rigid and cold, tucked deep within a hidden interior pocket, a place where one might hide a secret or a treasure. With a careful snip of her shears, Sarah opened the lining. A heavy, tarnished object slid into her palm, followed by a folded piece of parchment, yellowed by time and mountain humidity. Her heart skipped a beat as she looked down at the object. It was a brass seal, the kind used by land surveyors to mark official boundaries. She unfolded the paper. It wasn't a letter, but a map, a detailed survey of the valley floor, including the very land Willow Creek sat upon. But the lines were different from the official town records. According to this map, the unpublic grazing lands the mayor had been selling off actually belonged to a protected mountain trust, a trust that bore the name of Gideon's family. "Gideon?" Sarah's voice was barely a breath. Gideon looked up from the table where he was cleaning a lantern. His eyes fell on the map, and his jaw tightened. The silence stretched, only filled with the wind outside. "Now you know," he said quietly. "The mayor didn't just want me gone because I was a lawman who wouldn't take a bribe. He wanted me gone because my family owns the water rights to the northern end of the valley. Without those rights,
His land deals are worth nothing." The pieces of the puzzle clicked together with a sickening snap. Sarah realized then that her crime wasn't a coincidence. She had been the seamstress in the mayor's house. She had been the one moving between rooms, perhaps seen as someone who saw too much. She remembered seeing the mayor hiding documents behind the library clock, the same clock he claimed the stolen watch had been sitting near. "He didn't just shame me to hide his theft," Sarah realized, her voice growing stronger. "He shamed me to discredit the only witness who could testify that he was tampering with the valley's land deeds. If I'm a thief, no judge will ever believe my word about his papers." This was the dark side of the Old West's legal system, how easily it could be manipulated by those with the means to control the narrative. But they had forgotten one thing: the wilderness has a way of stripping away lies. Gideon walked over and looked at the map. "He thinks the ridge is a place where secrets go to die. He doesn't realize it's the only place where the truth has room to breathe." For the first time, Sarah didn't feel like a victim. She felt like a guardian of the truth. But as the wind outside picked up a mournful howl, she knew the mayor's desperation would soon bring the storm to their doorstep.
The mountain did not wait for the men to settle their scores. It arrived first. By morning, the sky was a bruised charcoal, and the temperature had plummeted. In the high country, a late-season blizzard isn't just weather, it's a physical weight that crushes the spirit of the unprepared. Gideon was boarding up the livestock shed when the silhouettes appeared through the swirling white. 3 riders, hunched low against the gale, their horses stumbling in the deepening drifts. At the lead was Mayor Higgins. He wasn't the polished politician of Willow Creek now. His fine wool coat was soaked through, and his face was the color of curdled milk. He didn't come with an apology. He came with a crumpled warrant, his hand shaking as he tried to point toward the cabin.
"Gideon North!" he shrieked over the wind. "You're harboring a fugitive and obstructing the law. Move aside, or you'll share her fate."
Gideon didn't flinch. He stood his ground, not with a weapon, but with the calm of a man who knew the mountain was about to speak louder than any warrant.
"The law doesn't exist in a whiteout, Higgins," Gideon shouted back. "The only law right now is survival, and your horses are flagging."
Sarah watched from the window, her heart racing. She saw the mayor's hired hand slip from his saddle, his limbs turning leaden with the first stages of hypothermia. This was the educational reality of the ridge. In a blizzard, pride is the first thing that kills you. The body begins to shunt blood to the core, and the mind grows clouded. Without immediate shelter, they would be dead before the sun went down. Sarah made a choice. She didn't think of the shaming or the whispers. She thought of the mountain. She opened the heavy cabin door, the wind screaming into the room.
"Bring them in!"
she cried out. Gideon looked at her, surprised, then nodded. He dragged the half-frozen men into the warmth of the cabin. For the next 3 hours, the scene was one of desperate labor. Sarah didn't use her sewing skills for fashion. She used them for survival. She moved with efficiency, heating stones in the hearth to wrap in blankets, a frontier method for slowly raising a person's core temperature without shocking the heart. She prepared a broth of dried herbs and salted beef, feeding it to the man who had sought to arrest her just hours before. The mayor sat by the fire, shivering, his eyes darting toward the map Sarah had left out on the table. The power dynamic had shifted. Here, in the heart of the storm, the mayor's gold was worthless. His life was in the hands of the woman he had tried to destroy.
The blizzard howled through the night, but inside the cabin, the only sound was the steady crackle of cedar logs. By morning, the wind had died down to a whisper, and the world outside was buried under a blanket of pristine, shimmering white. The air was silent, the kind of silence that only follows a great storm, a reset for the earth and the souls upon it. Mayor Higgins sat by the hearth, his face pale and drawn. He looked at the map on the table, then at Sarah, who was calmly stoking the embers. He saw the way she moved, no longer with the hesitant flinch of a shamed servant, but with the quiet authority of a woman who had mastered the wild. "You could have let us freeze," Higgins muttered, his voice stripped of its usual bravado. Gideon stood by the door, looking out at the sun breaking over the peaks. "Up here, we don't let the mountain take anyone," he said, "not even those who don't deserve the mercy." The reckoning was quiet. There were no shouts, no violence. Gideon handed the mayor the survey map. "You'll go back to Willow Creek," Gideon stated firmly. "You'll tell them the watch was found in your own study. You'll clear Sarah's name in the town ledger. If you don't, this map goes to the circuit judge in the capital." Higgins looked at the evidence of his own greed, then at the two people who had saved his life. He knew his power was an illusion built on shadows, and the light of the ridge had finally chased them away. He nodded slowly, a broken man who had finally been forced to see the truth. Once the trail was packed enough for travel, the three men departed. Sarah stood on the porch, watching them descend until they were nothing more than dark specks against the snow. For a moment, the thought of returning to town, to the shops, the gossip, and the easy life crossed her mind. Gideon walked up behind her, his presence a warm anchor in the cold air. "The trail is open, Sarah," he said softly. "You're free. You can go back to your old life. Your name is clean." Sarah looked at her calloused hands, then at the vast, beautiful horizon that stretched forever. She thought of the peace she had found in the hard work, the safety she felt in the silence, and the family she had found in a man who saw her worth when no one else would. "I am home, Gideon," she replied, turning to him with a smile that rivaled the morning sun. They weren't just two outcasts anymore. They were the heart of the ridge. As they walked back into the cabin together, the mountain stood tall behind them, a silent witness to a story of love, redemption, and a survival that went far deeper than the skin.
Thank you for joining us for this journey to the ridge. Sarah and Gideon's story reminds us that while the world may try to dim our light, the truth has a way of rising like the sun over the peaks. It's a testament to the fact that sometimes the greatest rescue isn't just being saved from a situation, it's being found by someone who truly sees who you are. What did you think of Sarah's choice? Would you have stayed on the mountain or returned to the town that turned its back on you? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. I love hearing your perspective. If this story touched your heart, please give it a like and share it with someone who needs a little hope today. And don't forget to subscribe and click that bell icon so you never miss a tale of the Old West. For more stories of love and redemption, check out our featured playlist on the screen now. Until next time, stay safe, stay strong, and keep the fire burning.